All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Anslone Show, and we have a lot to talk about today. We're going to be breaking down Zelensky's interview on 60 Minutes, Steve Witkoff, the guy who Trump has heading the negotiations with Russia, and his discussion and conversation with Fox News host Sean Hannity, and also this really important article from Axios that I want to take some time and break down on the divide in the Trump administration on the Iran policy. But before I get into the news today, just want to tell everybody, share this show out there, get it out there to a few more people. We are growing. We're very happy with the growth we're seeing on this show. It's because so many of our listeners are taking the time to share the show, subscribe to the show. So if you're watching on X, just hit the repost, put it out there. If you want to engage, we've already had some people in the live chat. Go over to the YouTube channel, subscribe, and then leave us a comment. I do have guests coming back to the show from ads. I think this is an incredibly important article. It was written by Barack Ravid at Axios. And I guess the importance of this article isn't necessarily that everything in here is gold. It's a lot of propaganda and things like that. But I think it gives some very important insight into Trump's Iran policy. And let's start off by just talking about the author for a second. Barack Ravid, this is an IDF veteran. This is somebody who received an award from the Biden administration for his reporting following October 7th, right? Everything, all the propaganda that entered the US mainstream, all the insights, reporting from either Tel Aviv or Washington on what's happening in the administration when it relates to Israel. Barack Ravid is the man with the best connections, and often is having the scoops for the article. And so whenever he has something, it's really important to read it to understand that there's going to be a lot of propaganda in his article, that this is a man that amplifies Israeli Hezbollah, far more than even, from the American perspective, a Tel Aviv perspective. But understanding that and then reading his articles could give you really important insights into American foreign policy. And he starts off by saying President Trump has vowed to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but inside his national security team, there is a divide on the best way to do it. And he says right now, it seems like plan A is negotiations, talking, but they are getting ready for plan B, and that's going to war with Iran, bombing Iran. They're saying that the deployment of the B-2 bombers, there's, I believe, 5 of them in Diego Garcia, this island down the Indian Ocean, where they would have the range to go and strike Iran, that's a part of the military buildup for the United States to go and attack Iran should the diplomatic path not work out. But there's an argument in the administration. There are people within the administration who are saying, don't even go down the diplomat path. Don't even bother to try to talk or engage with the Iranians. We simply should just go to war and start bombing them right away. And so Ravid writes, one camp, unofficially led by Vice President Vance, believes a diplomatic solution is both preferable and possible, and that the U.S. should be ready to make compromises in order to make that happen. Vance is highly involved in Iran policy discussions, another official said. And so as far as we could tell, Vance is the one in this camp who has the most realistic viewpoint. Also, Axios reported last week that Tulsi Gabbard was also pushing Trump to go down the diplomatic route with Iran. So you would assume that Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard is also in that camp. And then also Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's Middle East envoy, who is now heading negotiations when it comes to not only Iran, but also Russia and Israel and Gaza and the situation there. And so I think there's a few problems with Witkoff's involvement, and particularly, his stance and being a part of the pro-negotiation camp. One is that there's probably too much on Witkoff's plate. If he's going to have the Russia portfolio, fine. The Gaza portfolio, fine. The Iran portfolio, fine. But the idea that he's going to have all three and lead negotiations on three when he's a diplomatic novice himself is just simply not something that we could expect. He may be a very intelligent man. He may understand real estate transactions and other transactions and be able to make a lot of money and sign some very good deals. But that doesn't mean, negotiating a business deal in Manhattan is far different than negotiating an actual deal between the Ayatollah and the US and managing Netanyahu and the Saudis and all these other forces at work in the Middle East. And so this is something that was brought up by John Mearsheimer on Deep Dive with Daniel Davis, and Charles Freeman, the former US ambassador, brought this up to Judge Andrew Napolitano on his show Judging Freedom. That essentially when you talk about Witkoff, you are talking about somebody here who not only is a diplomatic novice, but also has three major diplomatic portfolios. And so the idea that he's going to be able to ink a deal in any of these categories, I think, is unlikely. The other problem, and this is something that's been covered by my colleague at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, former guest of this show, and what Dave has explained is that Witkoff is putting forward with Iran as one of the U.S. conditions that Iran isn't going to be allowed to enrich nuclear fuel. And so the idea that Iran would give up their entire enrichment program is nearly just giving up their whole nuclear program, because they won't be able to, run their nuclear energy in a homegrown state without any enrichment program whatsoever. And so I think the U.S. is now asking Iran for far too much, and that means negotiations aren't likely to happen. And so if this is set up as Team A and Team B, which is Team A says try diplomacy first, but then we end up at war, and Team B is saying let's just go to war. If a player on Team A is making the negotiations completely unfeasible, as Witkoff is, he's actually ensuring that we end up going with the plan put forward by Team B. Now, and an other just piece of good news, I haven't seen a whole lot of attention paid to it. Interestingly enough, this was also initially reported by Axios, and that is Will Ruger, Afghan war vet, somebody who Trump appointed to be the envoy to Afghanistan. He was never confirmed. It was in like September of 2020 that Trump put it forward, but somebody who was in the government and who was very vocal about the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, who is a major critic not only of the war in Ukraine, but all the regime change wars in the Middle East, is now a part of the Trump administration. He's the deputy director of national intelligence. And so he'll actually be the one putting together the president's daily intelligence brief. And this could be a good sign, that because I do think Ruger is not only against going to war with Iran, but likely understands that Iran not only doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but isn't trying to make one. We listen to so many members of the Trump administration. They make it as if there's this countdown clock. We have 1, 2 months, maybe 6 months, but then Iran's going to have a nuclear bomb, and we can't allow Iran to have a nuclear bomb, when this is obviously untrue, because not only the Mossad and the IAEA, the international watchdog on nuclear weapons, but also the U.S. intelligence agency all say Iran's not trying to make a nuclear weapon. And so if Iran isn't even started the process of trying to make a nuclear weapon, they're months or years away from it. And that's if they started today, which they haven't agreed to do. Really, the only way that Iran, I think, would go down the path to make a nuclear weapon if they were convinced that there was no diplomatic route left with the United States. And so if the U.S. does go to the Iranians at this point and they say, listen here, the only way we're ever going to make a deal with you, the only way we're not going to go to war with you, is if you completely give up your enrichment program, then maybe the Iranians decide, well, our only option are completely give up our country's sovereignty, our ability to produce not just nuclear weapons, but medical devices and energy. Right, Iran at one point had a fairly advanced nuclear energy program that was able to power and give, their country a lot of power. And so that's something Iran wants to keep. Also, Trump apparently wants to include Iran having interactions with other groups and countries in the Middle East. And so they're going to say, no supporting the Shia militias of Iraq and Syria, which, by the way, did the majority of the fighting against the Islamic State, are majority responsible, the people who are actually on the ground, on the front lines, dying, getting blown up by ISIS suicide bombers. A lot of those were the Shia militias that were funded by the Iranians. These, what they always say, oh, Iran supports terrorism across the Middle East. They're talking about the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, whose, again, main goal was to fight against the Islamic State or Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen. These are who the U.S. wants Iran to stop arming. They also want Iran not to have a missile program. And this is important because Iran's missile program prevents, not the same as a nuclear deterrent, but still a significant deterrent to Israel. Israel isn't a very big country. And so if Iran starts to bombard Jerusalem and Tel Aviv with missile after missile after missile, then the Israeli civilians might leave the country. This could prevent a major problem for Tel Aviv. And so I think the U.S. and Tel Aviv really want to get rid of the Iranian nuclear missile program as well as their nuclear program. So now here, back to Ravid's article, he says that the other camp, which includes National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, is highly suspicious of Iran and extremely skeptical of the chances a deal that significantly rolls back Iran's nuclear program. Senators close to Trump, like Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton, also hold that view. And this camp believes, I think this is the most important part of the article, and I think the argument that this camp is likely to make that's going to be most convincing to Donald Trump, and I want to read this, believes Iran is weaker than ever, and therefore the U.S. should not compromise, but insists that Tehran fully dismantle its nuclear program. And so they are saying that, look, Hezbollah and Assad have been beaten. Iran is in a historically weak position. And so not only should we not just go to a reasonable nuclear deal, we should demand that Iran has no nuclear program whatsoever. They want war with Iran. This is absolutely insane. And look, we just had Pete Hegseth, and we played this clip on the show on Monday, saying last week that, look, the situation in Yemen should be a warning to the Iranians, when in reality, the situation in Yemen should be a warning to the Americans. We can't disable the Houthis' drone program, their missile program. The Houthis are still firing missiles at Israel and American warships in the Middle East. And so how the hell are we going to disable a fortified, a dug into the mountains nuclear program like Iran has? Again, this is a way to guarantee that Iran makes a nuclear weapon. Now, outside of the government in Washington, we also, in the article, lists people like, I think it's Mark Dubowitz, the CEO of Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. This is a major, pro-Israeli think tank in the United States. In this article, does mention, and it's kind of interesting, it doesn't put Netanyahu in the pro-war with Iran camp, but it says that Netanyahu is distinctly against diplomacy with Iran, and this caused some tensions between the Israeli leader and President Donald Trump when Netanyahu was last in the United States. And so this is all, I think that last point is interesting. I think it falls in line with what I've been saying on this show and the analysis that I've been putting forward, which is, at this point, I think Iran's perceived weakness by Tel Aviv and Washington in Tel Aviv means they see an opportunity where they don't have to go to war with Iran to get what they want. What they want is southern Lebanon, southern Syria, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, right? They want Jerusalem. And they're going to get all of this without having to go to war with Iran. Now, if the U.S. and Israel start bombing Iran, and Tehran decides to make nuclear weapons, and then Tehran has a nuke and a missile that they could deliver it to Israel, then Tel Aviv has to really actually sit down with Tehran and talk to Tehran and figure out how the hell they're not going to lose Jerusalem to an Iranian nuclear weapon. And so at this point, I think Netanyahu doesn't want diplomacy with Iran. He doesn't want a nuclear deal because he knows the Iranians aren't going to launch some aggressive assault on Israel. And they're, at this point, don't seem in a position or actually all that concerned with interfering what Israel is doing in ethnically cleansing the Palestinians and annexing huge chunks of Lebanon and the West Bank. And so if Israel is able to get away with that without going to war with Iran, I think they would prefer to do that. They don't want a nuclear deal with Iran, because when you have that in place, well, then the West could trade with Iran and build a relationship with Iran. And suddenly, all this propaganda that Israel has built up over years and years and years, convincing the American people that the Iranians are trying to build a nuclear weapon, they're on the brink of building a nuclear weapon. Well, that all goes away and they lose access to all that fear that's so important for the Americans not caring when we send 3.8 billion at a bare minimum of military aid to Israel every year, and Israel uses that military aid to just kill women and children again and again and again. All right, everyone. So I saw a lot of people in the live chat, kind of talking as I was breaking all that down. Really appreciate you guys going over to the YouTube channel. If you're just listening in on that, definitely share the program, but also head on over to the YouTube channel and weigh in the comment section. Now I have a couple clips here I want to play of Steve Witkoff talking about the the negotiations with Russia with Fox News host Sean Hannity. Let's play the first clip.
Is there with Putin a deal emerging, or is he trying to buy time, knowing that Putin sees a window of opportunity without hundreds of billions of U.S. dollars in weaponry, giving him a military advantage? Do you really see a deal emerging? Are you confident?
I think you used a very good word there, Sean, emerging. I do. This is the third meeting I've had with him. This last meeting lasted close to 5 hours. We had two of his key advisors in the room at the time, Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev. And it was a compelling meeting. And towards the end, we actually came up with, and I'm going to say finally, but I don't mean it in the way that we were waiting. I mean it in the way that it took a while for us to get to this place. What Putin's request is to have a permanent peace here. So beyond a ceasefire, we got an answer to that.
So I think if we could take what Witkoff says here at face value, this sounds very positive to me. And as we talked about on the show in the past, if you really want to bring an end to the war in Ukraine and stabilize the security situation in Europe, there's a lot the Americans can make concessions on to help the Ukrainians at the negotiating table that's going to create a more stable security environment across Europe. And so the idea that these talks took 5 hours, I think is a good sign that Witkoff said towards the end, we're able to finally start to understand each other and understand what the Russians are looking for. Again, I think this is a good sign. Throughout the Biden administration, one of the main problems that Washington had is there was an outright refusal, not only just to talk to the Russians, but to ever even attempt to see anything from the Russian perspective, right? That, this is like this toxic thinking that you're pro-Putin. Anybody who says, well, this is the way the Russians view it. Oh, you're just amplifying Russian propaganda. No, you're saying that the other side has a different viewpoint than ours, and we should recognize that and look at what that side wants when we're trying to get into diplomacy, right? Because if you look at what the Biden administration did in the lead up to the war with Ukraine in December of 2021, Biden administration in there for a year, Blinken and other U.S. officials are having brought to them documents by the Russians that are saying, if you close the door to NATO membership for Kiev, then there won't be a Russian invasion. And the Biden administration officials have said, we didn't take that seriously. We didn't think that the Russians actually thought that was an issue worth invading over, when Russia had been very explicit that this was an issue that they were going to invade over. And so this is why these negotiations are so important, and understanding the other side is so important, is this whole war could have been prevented if NATO membership for Ukraine was taken off the table in December of 2021. And even though the Biden administration had no intention of ever allowing Ukraine into NATO. I mean, this is something that even Boris Johnson has said recently, that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, none of these European states made a big push to admit Ukraine into NATO, right? Ukraine's asking to join NATO, but none of these other states are, but they're all arming Ukraine. So I think that's very telling. Let's move on to this next clip from Witkoff.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, this peace deal is about these so-called 5 territories, but there's so much more to it. There's security protocols. There's no NATO, Article 5. I mean, it's just, a lot of detail attached to it. It's a complicated situation, rooted in some real problematic things happening between the two countries, and I think we might be on the verge of something that would be very, very important for the world at large.
So again, I think if we could take this at face value, and of course there's an issue here with Witkoff as a novice diplomat, and maybe he's not understanding what the Russians are saying. Maybe he's not doing enough background research before he gets into the talks. All these things are very important. And again, if he's got other portfolios, how much time can he dedicate to each one? But if he does really think that, sure, the 5 Ukrainian territories are really important to Russia, and that's something that needs to be discussed and brought up and negotiated, but also the security arrangements with the rest of Europe and NATO and Ukraine, these I think are probably more important issues to Russia than even Ukraine is in a lot of ways. And so, for example, the Aegis Ashore, these missile that are designed to be missile defense systems, but can also fire Tomahawk missiles, and which could carry a nuclear weapon. These are positioned in Poland and Romania. To the Kremlin, this is entirely unacceptable. This is having strategic offensive assets too close to the Russian capital, too close to the Russian population, and something has to be done about it. The U.S., every single year, along with our NATO allies, we fly our nuclear bombers up to 12 miles of the Russian border. We call them steadfast new war games. Again, we hold these every year. We're constantly conducting war games in the Baltic states, in the states surrounding the Black Sea, in the waters just off Russia's coast. All these things, I think Moscow would be very happy to make concessions when it comes to Ukraine if the West is willing to agree not to conduct war games in Eastern Europe, for NATO not to have permanent military installations in Eastern Europe, for the U.S. to reduce its deployment of troops on the European continent, to not be in waters that are around Russia, to not have this economic war on Russia. There's so many things that the U.S. and the West could do to help Ukraine get a better deal at the table, and we just haven't gone down that road at all. So now I have one last, this is a pretty short clip of Witkoff and Hannity.
On top of that, I believe there's a possibility to reshape the Russian-United States relationship through some very compelling commercial opportunities that I think give real stability to the region too. Partnerships create stability.
So, I think this one is important just because there does have to be these economic and commercial opportunities put in place. There's so much hysteria. There's so much, anti-Russian sentiment and propaganda that has really infected the minds of so many Americans. And to break that down, you're going to have a lot of trade between those two nations. And this is a place where Witkoff probably understands the situation a little bit better. He's, an expert on business deals and real estate deals, and he understands how these deals get done and how important they could be on a cultural level. And so hopefully he is serious about going down this road. Now, I have a couple clips next here from Zelenskyy on 60 Minutes. Now, we can't play the actual just response and the whole clip from 60 Minutes. And so this is Zelensky responded in Ukrainian anyways, and so we have an AI translation giving Zelensky's response. Let's play the first
I
clip.
believe, sadly, Russian narratives are prevailing in the U.S. How is it possible to witness our losses and our suffering, to understand what the Russians are doing, and to still believe that they are not the aggressors, that they did not start this war? This speaks to the enormous influence of Russia's information policy on America, on U.S. politics and U.S. politicians.
So I thought this was an important point to get into, because what the other side does here, what the pro-Ukrainian side does, is they like to say anybody who's in the camp who says that the war was provoked, that the West provoked Russia to invade Ukraine, will say that we're arguing that the Ukrainians started the war. And that's not what we're saying. You know, Russia obviously invaded Ukraine and started a major war when they did that in 2022. The point is all these things happened after the end of the Cold War, NATO expansion, but particularly since 2014, the US coup in Ukraine, installing in a very pro-Ukrainian nationalist government that cracked down on the ethnic Russian population of Ukraine, and then backing that government, talking about taking the Russian naval base in Crimea in 2014. That was a huge deal. And just pushing and arming Ukraine and talking about making Ukraine a member of the NATO alliance. That's why they say Russia invaded Ukraine, not this fake argument that Zelensky is putting up. Now, let's play our last clip of Zelensky here.
Would you invite President Trump to Ukraine?
With pleasure, please. We want you to come, and I think to come and to see you, think you understand what's going on here. Okay, we respect your position, you understand. But please, before any kind of decisions, any kind of formats of negotiations, come to see people, civilians, warriors, hospitals, churches, children destroyed or dead come. Look, and then let's move with a plan. How to finish the war. You will understand with whom you have a deal. You will understand what Putin did, and we will not prepare anything. It will not be theater with preparing actors in the streets and etc. We don't do this. We don't need it. You can go exactly where you want in any city which has been under attacks. What I said to them, just to come and to understand.
So the first thing here, I don't think Trump is going to Ukraine. I don't think it's important for Trump to go to Ukraine. But what Zelensky is doing in this whole 60 minutes piece, I wish I could have showed you actual clips from the 60 minutes piece, because it's like laughable propaganda the entire time. You know, the host is going, Zelensky's elected, but Putin is a dictator. Well, Putin was elected too. Right? And he's actually within the term that was given to him by the electorate when they went out and voted in the elections. Where when people say Zelensky's unelected, it's because his official term in office has expired and he's only staying in office through a martial law declaration. So this doesn't make a situation where Putin is just a dictator and Zelensky is just the great democratically elected Winston Churchill. So that's the first part of it. And then also in the whole segment, they're just going on about how all these horrible things that Russia has done in Ukraine. And certainly, you know, hundreds of dead kids, Ukrainian children is horrible. You know, they don't really get into that. Some of them likely were killed by the Ukrainian forces themselves as they were fighting against Russian forces. But they just go on, and there's no coverage. There's none of this for Gaza, right? If they did an interview like they did in Ukraine in Gaza, it would be absolutely horrific. They would have to censor so much. And yet when they do it on Ukraine, it's just a big deal. Now, the last thing I want to get into there is the propaganda trips, right? So Zelensky is saying that if you come to Ukraine, we're not going to escort you around in this propaganda trip like J.D. Vance said that the Ukrainians did during the feud in the Oval Office between Trump, Zelensky, and Vance. But that is what would happen, and that's what's happened time and time again. It's always happening when it comes to the situation in Israel. So I just think that's what they're trying to do with Donald Trump. They're trying to get him to Ukraine so they can parade him around and just make it seem like there's this awful situation in Ukraine and that Trump has to be overly sympathetic to Ukrainians and give them anything they want, when in reality, what the American responsibility, what we need to do for the Ukrainians here is help them to end the war. All right, everybody, that's what I have for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. You could really help us out by subscribing to the show, particularly on YouTube. So head on over to the channel. Additionally, you can just tune in live every Monday and Wednesday at 4:45. Be sure to retweet and repost the show. Give us positive ratings and review. All that stuff really helps us out. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back with another show on Monday.